We have one of those few good men as our guest speaker this morning, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce him to you. I met this man several months ago, and I was so impressed with his understanding of constitutional government, his Christian character and commitment, that I just really sought for the opportunity to allow him to come and be a part of one of our services here. And as we contemplated God and Country Day, I could think of no better guest than this man that we are now introducing to you this morning, Sheriff Ray Nash. He began his law enforcement career as a police dispatcher while he was still in high school. He has since served in law enforcement for nearly 30 years and brings a wide range of experience to the profession. He has served as a police chief for the municipalities of both Irmo and Summerville, South Carolina. In the mid-1980s, Ray served on the training staff of the Institute of Policy Technology and Management at the University of North Florida, where he was responsible for all microcomputer tactical training and special investigation courses. He is currently serving his third term as the elected sheriff in Dorchester County, South Carolina. As the chief administrator for 3 law enforcement agencies, he understands the unique challenges and pressures faced by law enforcement officers and their leaders. Sheriff Nash has provided consulting services and leadership training to law enforcement agencies for over 20 years. In 1998, he founded the Police Dynamics Institute to provide character-based leadership training and technical service to law enforcement agencies around the world. He has personally trained thousands of officers, nationally and internationally, in his character-based training program called Police Dynamics. Ray has traveled to Romania twice in the invitation of their national police to train their crime prevention unit and National Academy instructors. In addition, he's trained Russian police commanders at the Moscow Police College and over 30 international police delegations here in the United States. Leaders from around the world are looking to Dorchester County Sheriff's Office and the principles of Police Dynamics for answers to the difficult problems faced by law enforcement. Agencies throughout the U.S. and overseas have adopted the program and are reporting great success in fighting crime and improving officer performance. Ray holds an A.S. degree in criminal justice and a B.S. degree in adult education from Southern Illinois University. Concern over the decline in American values led Ray to found the Palomino Declaration Society and serve as its first president. The society seeks to promote good government and honorable citizenship based on the vision of America's founders. Ray resides in Summerville, South Carolina, with his wife and his 3 almost grown children. He is a founding member of Oak Brook Community Church and remains active in various church activities. He's also a 3rd-degree black belt in American Tactical Jiu-Jitsu, which is a street-oriented mixed martial art, and he's taught martial arts for about 20 years, and he served as the chief instructor for the Pineland Karate Academy, Christian Martial Arts Academy, and Focal Point Martial Arts. Not only that, I'd like to add, Sheriff Nash understands the Constitution of the United States. These elected officers that are here this morning and those that will be elected this Tuesday, whenever they are sworn in, they will put one hand on an open Bible, they'll raise another hand to God, and they will make a promise to God Almighty and to the American people. And that promise is not to please the party bosses. That party is not to please Katie Couric and the media. That promise is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Unfortunately, we have many people in Washington and our state governments that do not understand constitutional government. They've never read the Constitution. that have never studied the Constitution. We have judges sitting on the bench that have never read or studied the Constitution. We have attorneys, we have businessmen, we have law enforcement officers, we have doctors, we have engineers, we have professionals at every level of society that are ignorant of the Constitution. It's not taught, it's not promoted, it's many times ignored and even expunged from various and sundry governments. Most of the problems that we have in our country today are caused by two things. One, a lack of commitment to old-fashioned honesty and moral values. And number two, a lack of commitment to constitutional government. If we could correct those two problems, 90% of all the problems that we have in our country would disappear. Sheriff Ray Nash is a man that understands the Constitution. He understands the importance of those values and those principles. And by the time he's finished in these next few minutes, I believe that each of us are going to be better prepared. We're going to be more aware of those essential ingredients that we need to not only be good public servants, but to be good citizens. And so it's my distinct honor and privilege, and I want the people of Crossroad Baptist Church and Pensacola, Florida, to give a real warm and enthusiastic welcome to Sheriff Ray Nash.
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you. Thank you for making me feel so welcome. Thank you, Chuck, for such a lengthy introduction. Mom did a great job on that bio, don't you think? I'm just so proud of her. She makes me sound so special and so wonderful. But seriously, y'all have been just great. Already I've had a wonderful experience here fellowshipping with Pastor Chuck and his family and the staff here at the church. You really have made me feel welcome. The hospitality has been incredible. I was at the hotel room last night. There was a great big fruit basket, that was waiting on me there from the church. That was just wonderful. And, of course, us guys know what to do with those fruit baskets like that when we get home. Honey, see what I got for you, right? I saw this basket, and I thought of you, and here it is. But that'll be just wonderful. And we want to start out this morning with some scripture, but before I do, I want to sort of set the stage for it just a little bit, because as a sheriff, one of the great privileges that I have is the opportunity to, and one of these two men will have that opportunity too soon, I'm sure, to administer the oath of office. Chuck mentioned that, and that's a very special, solemn opportunity to administer the oath of office where you promise to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution to a new deputy sheriff. There's no higher honor that a sheriff can pay to somebody in a professional capacity, and we take it very seriously in Dorchester County. We take the oath of office on the Bible, as you suggested. George Washington started that tradition, 1789, when he was first inaugurated, and some years later, during his farewell address, he said this. He said, "Where is the security for reputation, for property, or for life if our sense of religious obligation should ever desert our oaths?" And by that, I believe Washington meant that when you say those words, "So help me God," they've got to mean something. And if you don't have a sense that there's a God, if you don't have a sense that there's a supreme being, this supreme judge of the world that is going to hold us accountable for our actions, accountable for the rectitude of our intentions, as our founders might have said, then those words don't mean a whole lot. They're somewhat meaningless. And I think that was Washington's point, is that we must never lose our sense of religious obligation when we administer an oath of office or an oath before a court, before testimony. Now, I was a little bit embarrassed this morning. I got here, and Chuck ushered me back into his office, and I said, "Pastor, I forgot to bring my Bible. And I need a Bible to stand up there." And he said, "Well, I got a whole bunch of them to choose from here. But they were all King James." He said, "Well, we're a King James only church." I said, "Well, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I have a friend of mine that's a King James only kind of guy, and we were traveling together one day on an airplane, and we were sitting, it was 3 seats, and he was sitting next to me, I was in the middle, and there was this young lady that we didn't know that was sitting to my right. Well, he starts a conversation with the young lady across me. I'm sitting in the middle. And I'm trying, I only got my NIV Bible out, you know, and I'm trying to read. And they're trying to talk back and forth, and it was a little bit uncomfortable. But we ended up talking about spiritual matters, and I jumped in and was able to share the gospel with this young lady right there out of my NIV Bible. And she, you know, made the prayer of salvation, professed her faith in Christ, and got saved right there. So when we got back to the airport, I told my friend, I said, see there, you can get saved without the King James. And he said, yeah, you can get saved, but you can't get wisdom. So we'll see if we can't gain a little wisdom this morning by looking at this King James. And what we do is the same thing that I think Washington did. At least that's what the artist renderings of his inauguration say, is he took the oath of office on an open Bible. And I'd love to know what passage he had it open to. I don't know if anybody's recorded that, but we like to take our oath on the Bible open to Romans chapter 13. Because that's the section of Scripture that deals with governing authorities. And I want to start there this morning. And it's interesting because my Bible back at the office, man, that page is so yellowed from the sweaty palm prints that had been put on that Bible over the years. I mean, there's a lot of stress involved with taking an oath of office. And I want our deputies to take it seriously. It's a very solemn occasion. I make a big deal out of it, and they get so nervous. I've had one of them faint. We had to stop the oath ceremony. We had to fan him for a few minutes before we get started again. I did this on Friday, and a young lady, she broke down in tears. I mean, I'm up there giving my little speech, and she's crying. We had to get her tissues. And, you know, I think that's a good thing because it means they're taking this very, very seriously. And I read this passage to them, Romans chapter 13. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Now, that word higher powers here, the context is governing authorities. We're not talking, Paul's not talking higher authority in the sense of the spiritual authorities here like he does in Ephesians, but governing authorities, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same, for he, this is important, is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Two important points here. Right there in Scripture, we see the twofold responsibility of government. Punish the evildoer and commend those that do good. And I emphasize this to our deputies because sometimes I think we focus so much on the justice side, we forget. Not only are we there as government leaders, and there's many of them in the room, and some soon-to-be government leaders in the room, is not only must we be those that discourage evil, we must also be those that encourage the good. And I think we forget that. So I want to take a minute. I'm out of my jurisdiction, but I want to take a minute and commend y'all for doing something good. I want to commend these government leaders. I want to commend these candidates for government leadership for getting involved in this critical component of American life. And I want to commend the rest of you for being here, bringing your families here. There's a lot of places you could be on a Sunday morning, and a lot of other people in America are not where they ought to be in a pew of a church. I want to commend you and your pastor and the leadership of this church for doing it. There's something special going on here, Chuck. And I don't know if you really firmly appreciate that or not, but I got that sense the minute I walked in. There's something very special. God's doing a powerful work here. So I commend you for being a part of that, allowing God to use you in that respect. So that's one thing. Second thing, 2 times in that short passage, it refers to us in government leadership, it refers to us as ministers of God. Now, you don't think about a government leader as a minister. When you think about a minister of God, you think about a pastor of a church, typically. Somebody who's been called into this ministry. But see, that's only one type of minister. Because there's all different types of ministers, just as there are all different types of ministries. This is the ministry of government. And it's a service. You know, sometimes I think other countries have it figured out better than us. In America, for instance, we have a lot of departments. We have the Department of Defense. We have the Department of Energy, the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior. But when you go to other nations, you know what you find? You don't find departments so much, you find ministries. the ministry of defense, the ministry of justice, the ministry of the interior. In fact, in other countries, they don't have a president by title. They have another name for their chief executive. What do they call him? The prime minister. Out of all the other ministers, he's the prime minister, minister number one. And so I try to get that point across as we administer this oath of office, because we are ministers. Just like he has been called into a ministry, we have been called into a ministry, and we need to reflect upon that in that sense. And so consequently, we have a very close affinity with our pastors and ministers of God and ministers of the Word. We have the ministry of the Word, and the ministry of the sword, according to Paul. And so we have close affiliation. We work very closely with our pastors and all back home and have a lot of opportunity to interact with them. In fact, the other night, one of my deputies was on patrol, and he got behind a car that was kind of weaving down the road. And suspecting he had a drunk driver, he pulled him over and was quite surprised to find at the wheel of the car one of our local pastors. And he shined the light in the car, and he said, he recognized him immediately. He said, "Pastor, your eyes, they appear to be bloodshot. Have you been drinking?" And the pastor looked up at him and he said, "Officer, your eyes appear to be glazed. Have you been eating donuts?" Now, you might imagine that the officer did not appreciate that, all right? And he looked in the car, and there on the console was a paper cup with some kind of liquid in it. He said, "Pastor, what's in that cup?" And the pastor said, "Well, that ain't nothing but water." So let me see that. He reached in and sniffed the cup. And he said, "Pastor, that's not water, that's wine." And the pastor said, "Hallelujah, he did it again." So we have these opportunities. And Chris, if we're going to start the slideshow, that'd be great. We have these opportunities to interact. And I want to share with you today some thoughts about called the foundation of American government. And it's exactly what Pastor Chuck mentioned a moment ago. What did the founders really have in mind, and where do we fit in today, and how does this relate to our daily life and our understanding of these principles? And why is it important to talk about foundations? Because the Bible tells us that if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And so it's critically important to us to have this understanding of the foundation of our government system. And there's two basic principles. There's two founding principles that our forefathers put into place. Y'all know about our forefathers, right? The four guys that wrote the Constitution? It was actually more than four, all right? In fact, depending on how you might define a founding father, maybe 250 of them or so. If you count the ones that signed the Declaration, the ones that signed the Constitution, the ones that were involved with the Bill of Rights, the first president, first several presidents, first several Congresses, Supreme Court justices, etc., heroes of the American Revolution, those that were educators of the time that were highly influential in the founding era, maybe 250 or so. And they had a lot of things in common. And I think if you were kind of to boil down their thoughts and principles, it would come to two basic fundamental principles. Number one, government must have a moral foundation. In other words, for government to exist and function properly and to stand long term, there must be a fundamental foundation of a sense of rightness and wrongness. There must be an absolute rightness and wrongness, and it must be something that exists independently of our own opinions about it, a non-relativistic view of morality. And the founders were very, very strong in their commitment to this moral foundation. And secondly, that government must be constitutionally limited, because you see, government, and the founders recognize the sinfulness of man. They recognize that government, left to its own devices, will just grow and grow and grow and amass more and more power to itself, and that would be very destructive, and consequently we must limit government constitutionally, this jurisdiction of government. So that's kind of the two fundamental principles if you boil everything down. And let's talk about the first one for a minute. What was the moral foundation that the founders were looking for? Can you imagine if we woke up tomorrow morning and this was the headline in the newspaper? The Supreme Court rules America is a Christian. Can you imagine what would happen to, the ACLU would have a heart attack. They would just, the Americans, the separation of church, they have a flopping fit. Who knows? The turmoil that it would generate. But you know what? That was, in fact, the headline. In 1892, there was a famous Supreme Court case, somewhat lost to history, but it was the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States. And this is a very interesting ruling in that in 1892, the court went to quite some length to articulate the founding nature, the Christian heritage of our country. They went all the way back to Columbus. And they traced it all the way back up to the present time of that era of how over and over and over again, tremendous body of evidence that points to the fact we were founded as a Christian nation, not in the sense that we expected everybody to be Christian. That's a matter of the heart. That's a matter of conscience. Government has no right to go into that arena. The founders understood that. That's not what they meant by this, not what the court meant. It's that it was founded upon Christian principles, Christian moral foundation, a biblical worldview. That's what they meant by that. So here's your homework assignment. Your homework assignment is, when you get home, go to Google and look up the Church of the Holy Trinity versus U.S. And I want you to read the last 2 or 3 pages of this Supreme Court ruling. It's going to give you just a wonderful synopsis of some of the history attached to this. And so the question often gets thrown at us, well, you know, the founders, they were just a bunch of deists. They were a bunch of deists, or they were a bunch of atheists. We hear that too. They imbued this secular government that was separated from church and state and all that. And you start to ask yourself, well, is that really true? You know, we've been told that and we've been taught that, but is it really true? And I think it's important that we understand some definitions. For example, a theist. Well, what is a theist? How would you define a theist? You're free to interact here a little bit. Person that believes in at least one God. All right? Because you can have a monotheist, or you could have a polytheist, or a lot of other theists, but a person that believes in at least one God. Well, what's a deist? A deist is a type of theist that believes that God created the universe, that God set everything into motion with a bunch of physical principles and causes and effects and secondary causes, but now he doesn't get involved. Now he just kind of turned it loose and he lets it run on its own, and he doesn't get involved in the affairs of man anymore. The earth just kind of on autopilot. Often it's called the clockmaker theory, that God was this celestial clockmaker that just kind of wound everything up, put it in motion, now that's hands off. That's a kind of a technical definition of what a deist is. And of course, we know what an atheist is, someone who does not believe in the existence of God. And when you look at the founders, oftentimes people say, well, they're just a bunch of deists. I had a Sunday school teacher at my church the other 2 or 3 weeks ago said that he's a professor of world religions at one of our local universities, and he just kind of made a side comment that a lot of the founders were deists. And I called him on it, you know, and because I don't think the evidence supports that. But when you hear people say our founders were a bunch of deists, who are the two they always throw out at us as examples? Jefferson and Franklin, right? Those are the two big ones, and maybe Paine, but those two for sure. So let's take a look at what some of these men that are accused of being deists, that don't believe God governs in the affairs of men, let's see what they had to say about some of this stuff. And TJ is one of them here. Jefferson said, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we have lost the only firm basis, the foundation, which is a conviction in the hearts and minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God? He says that in the Declaration as well, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath. Now, folks, a deist that doesn't believe that God intervenes in the affairs of man would not be fearful of God's wrath. He wouldn't see God doing anything about it. He just kind of lets you have natural consequences, but you don't have him intervening and imposing his wrath. He went on to say, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever. The words of a deist that would abide by this clockmaker theory, I'll let you be the judge of that. Interestingly, Jefferson's talking about slavery. Jefferson, the slave owner, is talking about slavery. He recognized back then the evils of slavery, but it was so wrapped up in the life of American colonists in the early founding of the country. It was kind of tough to get loose from it, but they recognized the evil of it, and they recognized it was absolutely contrary to some of the moral principles that we were trying to establish in the founding of our nation. Then we go over to Franklin. Franklin was one of the few that were a delegate both to the Second Continental Congress, where they signed the Declaration, and the Constitutional Convention. And during the Constitutional Convention, he said this, I have lived, sir, a long time. And he had. He was like 80-something years old, 84 years old, something like that. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. This man had biblical knowledge. Now, we could argue that Jefferson and Franklin were not Christians, and they probably weren't, according to the historical record. I mean, Jefferson denied the deity of Christ. He believed that Christ's teachings were the best moral pattern that we had, the best moral system, but denied the deity of Christ. But he called himself a Christian. Franklin, likewise, perhaps was not. But look at the biblical worldview and the biblical knowledge that these men had during this time. He goes on to say, I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. The words of the deist. And these are the two that get thrown out most often. And we can look at the founders, and we can see example after example after example. They weren't deists. Most of them were evangelical Christians. The vast majority, certain exceptions, vast majority, evangelical Christians, many of them trained in the seminary. Today we call them a bunch of Bible thumpers. That's what we'd call them today, if they were around. So the next question becomes, well, did these Christians that had this Christian worldview, did they have this idea that church and state should somehow be separate? So I always like, when I do this class for students, I always like to start out with a little quiz. So you're going to get invited to a quiz. The quiz is, in which of the founding documents do we find that phrase, separation of church and state? And here's your choices. Was it A, in the Constitution, or B, a little bit earlier, Declaration, C, the Bill of Rights, or D, the Federalist Papers, which were a series of essays written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton to kind of convince the American people that we needed a federal constitution. We needed to get away from the Articles of Confederacy and have a more federal approach to government. And so how many of you, just not to embarrass anybody, but just how many of you think, well, it's got to be in the Constitution? Okay, I see a few hands, all right. How many of you say, well, no, it's in the Declaration of Independence? Not too many takers there. How about the Bill of Rights, First Amendment and all? Okay, I got most of the hands went up then. Or how many say no, it's in the Federalist Papers? All right, you got a smattering there. How many of you think it's a trick question? Yes, see, because really and truly it was a trick question, because the answer is none of the above. It actually came from a letter that Jefferson wrote when he was president. Many of y'all know the story, to the president of the Danbury Baptist Association, because there had been this vicious rumor floating around. They must have read it on the internet or something. This vicious rumor floating around that America was going to establish the Congregationalist denomination as the official denomination of the country. And the Baptists were concerned about this, and Jefferson said, no, we're not going to have an official denomination. You're safe. You can continue to be a Baptist, and that's not a problem. Not in any of the founding documents, and it's totally been taken out of context in America today. So let's take a look at some of these founders and what they had to say. We mentioned Washington earlier during his farewell address. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Notice he's not talking about economic prosperity, social prosperity. He's not talking about academic prosperity. He's not even talking about spiritual prosperity. He's talking about what? Political prosperity. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. Probably a subtle stab at Thomas Paine during that day. But he says, Washington says, the founder, the first president, the father of our country says, you can't even call yourself a patriot if you subvert the role that religion and morality play. And don't give me this stuff that you can have morality separate from religion. He says, experience and reason both have shown us that cannot be the case. National morality cannot prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And Washington understood this. Now, I love this picture of Washington. I've got to see this. It's at Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. And just a little aside note here, I don't know how many of y'all can see that thing that's around his neck. And how many historians in here, and you can't answer, Chuck, know what that thing is that's hanging around his neck? What is it? Okay, you're absolutely correct. It is a symbol of military rank, but what's the history behind it? You know that. It's called a gorget. And a gorget originally was the part of a knight's armor that went around the neck. And over time, they kind of made it smaller, and they just hung it around the neck symbolically to show military rank here when he was a colonel during the French and Indian War here. And interestingly, for you real historian buffs, you will recognize that as the crescent moon on the South Carolina state flag. Long may she wave, all right? Many people, somewhere along, you can see the dimensions of that show. That's not a crescent moon, and many people in South Carolina don't even recognize that connection. A little side note there. Now, you know, that may be the million-dollar question. Now you won't even need to use a lifeline. You've got that information. Noah Webster was an educator of the day, very influential. He wrote a book called Advice to the Young. He really ought to change that to Advice to the Young and the Old, because I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of good stuff in there, and you ought to take time to bother to read it. Small book, used to train a lot of America's youth during those ages. And he said, look, the best source and the best rules of morality can be found in the Bible, and the moral principles and precepts found in the Scriptures ought to be the basis, the foundation, for all our civil constitutions and laws. James McHenry, one of the signers of the Declaration, said, the Holy Scriptures can alone secure to society order and peace, and to our courts of justice and constitutions of government purity, stability, and usefulness. I love this guy, Robert Winthrop. I call this his Bible and bayonet speech. I just kind of envision him as being a guy that's, non-politically correct, that's just willing to speak boldly during that day. He's kind of like the Chuck Baldwin, of the day, I think. And he's just standing up and just speaking the truth with boldness. And he says, all societies of men must be governed in some way or another. The less they may have of stringent state government, the more they must have of individual self-government. You ask the average person in America today, what does it mean to be self-governing? And they'll say, Tuesday I get to go vote. And that's what it means to them. That is not what it meant to the founders. What it meant to the founders was you better govern yourselves. We're trying to establish a system of government that is constitutionally limited. Therefore, you must govern yourself. Because if you don't govern yourself and control your own passions and your own desires according to scriptural mandates, then this isn't going to work. And they understood that. He went on to say, men, in a word, must be necessarily controlled either by a power within them or a power without them. Either by the Word of God or by the strong arm of man, either by the Bible or by the bayonet. I kind of would rather have the Bible, than the bayonet, but that's me. Sam Adams, father of the Revolution, had some interesting things to say. The only true basis, foundation of all government is the laws of God in nature. For government is an ordinance of heaven. We saw that in Romans chapter 13, designed by this all-benevolent Creator. Cousin John comes along. Cousin John, Sam Adams says, is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any. It doesn't work for the government of any other kind of people. We've seen this throughout the history of the world. There was a study done by the University of Houston some years back that sought to figure out what the founders were up to. And they said, if we could isolate quotations from the founders, any time the founders quoted some other source, some outside source, if we could identify what those sources were, we could begin to get a picture of what motivated these founders. And so they got like 3,000 and something quotes where they had quoted an outside source, and they tracked them down. And you know what they discovered? That 34% of all of their outside direct quotes were directly from the Bible. Now, that was 4 times more than the next most often quoted source, which were people like Locke and Montesquieu and others that were sort of philosophers in ages just a generation prior. And interestingly, that many of those were men commenting on the Bible. And so either directly or indirectly, the vast majority of the quotes came out of the Bible. So I think it's very clear. And we could go on. This time will not permit. This is a sampling. This is the tip of the iceberg of what these men believed and what they wrote about. And if you don't, listen, stop reading what people say they said and go read what they actually said. Because if you go do a little bit of research yourself, because listen, today we got video technology and audio technology, and we record everything. Back then they wrote it down. It's still there. It's in the libraries are full of this stuff, but it has been slowly taken out of our history books, and we're missing it. So now I want to spend a little bit of time on this. The next point, the next one of the principles of the founders, a moral foundation, but then a government that's constitutionally limited. And we're going to look at 3 documents here. The Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And I want you to think of the Constitution in these terms. It is a grant of authority from whom? Yeah, we the people, right? The Constitution still says that. I checked it last week, make sure it hadn't changed. I heard about some of that stuff going on in California, and I thought maybe they changed it and forgot to tell me. But no, it still says that we the people have established as government, ratified by the states. And I want you to understand that the United States Constitution established a federal system of government. It didn't establish state government. State governments preceded. The federal government is a product of the state government. The state governments ratified the Constitution of that day and continue to this day in terms of amendments. And so it was the federal system that was created by the Constitution, by the states, by the people, not the other way around, and that's common misunderstanding. So federal system of government, and it divided governmental authority at the federal level into three distinct branches. This is American Government 101. What were the three branches? Executive, judicial, and legislative, right? And what's the role of the legislative? They make the laws. What does the executive do? Enforces it. What does the judicial do? Interprets it, decides what does the law really say, how do they meet the application of the law, etc. And that was that's a constitutional separation of powers. Now, where do you think the founders got such an idea as that? Dividing the government into three branches. We can look at the book of Isaiah and make a good argument. Look here. The Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. There's judicial, legislative, and executive right there. And we understand God is sovereign, and God is all-powerful, and God is wise, and God is absolutely 100% just, and we can entrust to him all three components, bless you, all three components of government. But man is sinful, and the founders understood this. And they said, we must separate these powers, and we must put some limitations on government. We can find this same principle of delegation of authority in our original founding document, the Declaration. What does it say? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth that equal and separate station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, then a decent respect for the opinion of mankind requires that they declare the causes that impel them to the separation. That's one sentence. And that's the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And I think what Jefferson is telling us very eloquently and somewhat long-windedly is, hey, y'all, we're about to break this thing off with Great Britain. Now, he may have said y'all. He was from Virginia. But we don't know. But we've already been at war. Listen, Lexington and Concord, that was 1775. We are now July 1776. We've been at war. We think we owe it to the rest of the world to tell them why, because a decent respect for the opinion of mankind requires that we declare the causes which impel us to this separation. Now, the second paragraph will be more familiar to you. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain what? Unalienable rights. You know what? Do you realize that biblical creationism is the foundation for our Declaration? Because without a Creator, we have no rights. Do you follow that? And folks, if we deny our Creator, we have abandoned our rights. This is why this debate is so critically important to us today. And he goes on to say that among these rights are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice it does not say you have a right to be happy. It does not say you have a right to be happy. You have a right to what? Pursue it. Finding it is up to you. There's no guarantees. Don't come tell me, don't I have a right to be happy? No, you don't. Nobody ever said that. Well, somebody may have said it, but they didn't say it. You have a right to pursue it. And that's why we have governments. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The people. It's the people. See, this was in opposition to the British view, which was the divine right of kings. Our founders said God has given to the people the power to govern themselves, and they can then delegate that power to a government, and they can create a government, a state government or a federal government, and they did. And Article 1 of our federal Constitution says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. Granted from whom? We the people, folks. There's a connection here. Follow with me. The executive power vested in the president. The judicial power vested in the Supreme Court of the United States and such other inferior courts as Congress may establish from time to time. These principles are there. If we just dig them out just a little bit and unpack this stuff, you can see what the founders were trying to do. They were establishing the structure of our federal government built on the moral foundation of the Declaration. This is a very important point. Because, see, the Constitution is very much a procedural, structural type of a document. Whereas a Declaration is more, it's a moral document. It's a, you know what? It's a theological document. It's full of moral principles and theological doctrines. And so that founders built this Constitution on this foundation contained in the Declaration of Independence. And when our founders said the laws of nature and if nature's God, it meant something, folks. They were talking about the authority of Scripture. That was a theological term at that time. We say the laws of nature and of nature's God today, and we think Darwinism and survival of the fittest, and that's not what they meant at all. The common law of England was built upon the foundation of Scripture. And so they understood what they were doing. And folks, if you take our Constitution and you try to interpret it separate from its moral foundation, you can turn and twist those words and make them say pretty much anything you want to. Is that not what we have seen taking place in America today? So let's turn to the Bill of Rights for a moment. The Bill of Rights comes along and establishes limitations on the federal government. The founders said separation of powers is not enough. We want to have some specific limitations placed upon the power of the federal government so it doesn't try to do things that are outside of its jurisdiction. So I want you to think about the Constitution establishing the authority of the federal government from we the people, and the Bill of Rights establishing its jurisdiction. Now see, jurisdictions are limitations that are placed on government or any other type of authority for that matter. For instance, I am the sheriff in Dorchester County, South Carolina. My authority is that of a sheriff. My jurisdiction is that of Dorchester County. I'm out of my jurisdiction now. I don't have the authority of a sheriff here. I can make a phone call back home and make things happen. But I don't have any authority here. I am outside of my jurisdiction. That is a geographical jurisdiction. There are other types of jurisdictions. We call it subject matter jurisdictions. For example, back home in my county, I have a right to tell you how fast you can drive your car. Must be within the posted speed limits. I do not have the right to tell you what kind of car you can drive. That's outside of my jurisdiction. I have a right to tell you how loud you can play your music. You can't disturb the neighborhood. But I don't have the right to tell you what kind of music you can play. That's outside of my jurisdiction. And on and on and on. We can think of several examples of this. So let's look at the Bill of Rights as establishing the jurisdiction of the federal government established by the Constitution. Let's look at the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right of the people to peaceably assemble to redress the government for grievances. All right? Now, how many fifth graders do we have in the room today? Any fifth graders in the room? Any fifth grader can read that and tell you that applies to Congress. Am I right? Congress shall make no law. So unless you happen to be Congress, which is the legislative body of our federal government, unless you happen to be Congress and you happen to be in the process of making a law, the First Amendment really doesn't apply to you, does it? So how do we get this stuff about it applying to the state Supreme Court of Alabama? How do we get this stuff about it applies to the town hall that wants to put up a nativity scene, or a school district that wants to open a football game or graduation and prayer or post the Ten Commandments? How do we get this? And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But you can see that the First Amendment places jurisdictional limits on the legislative power of the federal government. Congress, you can pass any law that you want, but you better not pass a law that respects the establishment of a religion, nor prohibits the free exercise thereof, or abridges the freedom of speech, press, etc. You can't do that. It's outside of your jurisdiction. We're drawing the line there. That's the limit of your subject matter jurisdiction. Second Amendment. I love this one. I love this one. Listen, I'm from South Carolina, all right? If you get there and you don't have a gun, we'll give you one, all right? Just ask. Well, I mean, we think... we hold our Second Amendment rights, very, very sacred. And we love to hunt. And we love the right to protect our homes and our families against intruders and use our guns to do that. But that's got nothing to do with the Second Amendment. Nothing whatsoever. I don't know how this argument got in there. Got nothing to do with it. The Second Amendment's very clear. A well-regulated militia being necessary for the protection of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Folks, the whole purpose of it is right there. A free state, that's a capital S state. That's not the generic name for government. It's not, just a generic term for government in general. It is the state of Florida, the state of South Carolina, the state of Virginia. We realize that each state needs to have a well-regulated militia. That's not a militia. Pastor Chuck and I were talking about this on the way in. Not just a bunch of people say we're going to form a militia. This is the well-regulated militia. Most states had a militia. Many states still have a militia. I found out last night doing a little research on the web. Florida has a provision in your law to establish a state militia. It's called the Florida State Defense Force. And many states either call them a state defense force today. Militia kind of has gotten a negative term, a negative connotation. Or they call it the State Guard. In South Carolina, we have a State Guard. Not the National Guard, State Guard. It's a separate entity, cannot be federalized, and it's there to protect the state. And what does the militia consist of? It consists of the people. A militia is not a standing army. And the militia are us. It's the people that take up arms in a time of crisis, in a time of riot, in a time of insurrection, in a time of crisis, natural disasters, man-made disasters, terrorist attacks, invasion. It's the people. That's why you have a right to keep and bear arms, because you're not a standing army. We're not going to issue you a gun. You got the right to keep your own. And come when the time comes, you get called. And that's the idea, because that's the protection. And we could spend a lot of time on this, but this is a limitation on the federal authority. You cannot pass laws. You cannot confiscate arms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's an interesting word, Like, my coat, has a fringe, or a garment might have a fringe. You know what the fringe is? The fringe is the edge. You know what it says? Don't even come up to the edge. This is so important to us. Don't even come across that edge. Second Amendment. We don't have time to get too much. Third Amendment deals with quartering of troops. This is a limitation on the executive authority. All right? Mr. or Mrs. President, you are the commander-in-chief of the military forces of the United States. You can quarter your troops anywhere you want. But you better not put them in somebody's house against their will in a time of peace. And you better not do it in a time of war unless it's according to due process of law. We're drawing the line here. This is a limitation on your jurisdiction. Of course, this is what the British were doing to the early colonists, and they were saying you can't do that. You can't put your troops in our homes against our will. That's why we have a Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, kind of broken down into two parts. First says the right of the people to be secure in the persons, places, houses, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. What branch of the government searches and seizes? It's the executive branch. This is a limitation on the executive authority. Mr. and Mrs. President, you can go around and you can search places and you can seize things, but you better not do it in an unreasonable fashion. There better be some due process attached to this thing, because we're drawing the line. We're saying you can't go there. You can't just go search indiscriminately. There's got to be some proper legal grounds for doing it. And the second part of the Fourth Amendment goes on to say that no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. What branch of the government does this apply to? This is the judicial. The judiciary issues warrants. Mr. and Mrs. Judge, you issue any warrant that you want to, but it better be supported by probable cause. It better contain an affidavit with an oath or affirmation, and it better have some particular descriptions here, or you're out of bounds. You have exceeded the jurisdictional boundaries of the Fourth Amendment. And we could, if we had time, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, right on up to the 10th Amendment, and we could see limitation upon limitation upon the authority of the federal government. Now, what happened? Why are we in this mess that we're in? Chuck talked about. There's two pivotal dates, and I'm going to try to rush through this. One is 1865. Now, we know what happened in 1865. That was the end of the war between the states, often called Civil War. I'm from Charleston. We call it a lot of things. It's the war between the states. It's the war of northern aggression. It's the war for southern independence. The one I like the best is the war to prevent southern independence. That probably is more descriptive. And you got to be careful here, because you get into some political correctness here, and people say, "Oh, you're in favor of slavery." No, absolutely not. Give me a break. There's no reasonable, rational person on the face of the planet today that would support that. It was morally wrong. It was an evil in this country. It's a blight. We're still paying a lot of the prices for that. And certainly slavery was an issue. My research would indicate it was not the issue. There were a lot of issues. There were economic issues. There were sovereignty issues, constitutional issues. There were things of this. Slavery was one of them. But I don't think it was the pivotal issue. But it did get all wrapped up in there and created some problems. But be that as it may, a lot of changes took place in the aftermath of 1865 in terms of the power of the federal government going beyond some of its jurisdictional boundaries. I think that's a historical fact. And then this one. This is one we don't think about a lot. 1947. Anybody know what kind of was a pivotal event in the history of this nation in 1947? Let me tell you what I think. Yes, sir. No, well, maybe, but that's not the point I was looking for. Let me give you this. It was a Supreme Court decision called Everson versus Board of Education. And in Everson versus Board of Education, for the first time in history, the Supreme Court, in defiance to all precedent prior to that, said from now on, because of our interpretation of the 10th and particularly the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights now does no longer apply just to the federal government. The First Amendment no longer applies just to Congress, you know. Apparently, some of these Supreme Court justices were not smarter than a fifth grader. Where's Jeff Foxworthy when you need him? But they read that First Amendment and they came to a different conclusion. And now, since that day, the Bill of Rights has applied, according to the Supreme Court, to other branches of government and other levels of government. And now we see this imposition of federal authority saying, you can't have the Ten Commandments in front of the state Supreme Court in Alabama. You can't put a nativity scene up in the front of your town hall. You can't open your county council meetings with prayer. The citizens of Great Court, South Carolina, cannot open up their council meetings with prayer. You cannot post the Ten Commandments in a public place. You can't have a graduation ceremony in a public school or a football game or whatever open with prayer. Folks, the reason, listen to me very carefully, the reason we have abortion on demand in every state in America is because of this ruling right here. Because the federal government has all of a sudden come in and said that the Fourth Amendment gives a woman an expectation of privacy, which is not found in any of those documents either, to an unborn baby in her womb, and therefore she has a right to terminate the life of that child. The stuff that means a lot to us as Christians and constitutionalists in America today can be traced back to this. And I like to ask this question of my students. It's interesting the response that you get. Is it possible for one citizen to violate the constitutional rights of another citizen? And I'm not going to ask you that question, but I'll tell you, when I ask that question publicly, the vast majority of people will say, of course it is. And the answer is absolutely not. A citizen cannot violate your constitutional rights because what does the Constitution protect you from? The government. Only the government can violate a constitutional right. We have laws, we have statutes that protect you from each other, but it's the Constitution that protects you from government. And, you know, George Washington had something to say about this. He said, government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. I did a Google search on this the other night because I wanted to be sure I got the quotation exactly right. Believe it or not, an article written by Chuck Baldwin popped up on my search engine. He had quoted this in one of his articles, and so I felt pretty comfortable sharing it with you today. And, you know, if we lived out in the countryside somewhere, we had a little bunch of log cabins or something in the wilderness, fire would be very important to us. You know, we would use fire to heat our homes. We would use fire to cook our food. It would be a very important part of our life. In fact, fire would be so important to us that we would have within our homes a special place to put the fire. We call that the what? The fireplace, right? And as long as the fire stays in the fireplace, we can use it for a lot of good things. But what happens if that fire begins to spill out of the fireplace and gets on the floor of the house? Now we have a problem, don't we? Now we have a threat to our safety. And that fire would have to be stomped out immediately and brought under control and put back in the fireplace. Well, Washington's point was that, you know, fire is like government. And you know what? The Constitution is like the fireplace. And as long as the government stays within the confines of the fireplace, we can use it for some useful things. But if it starts to jump out of that fireplace, it presents a threat to our liberties, and it presents a threat to our safety. and it must be stomped out immediately. That's what constitutionalism is all about. That's what federalism is all about. That's what our vision of our founders is. That's what your pastor is all about, and many of you understand this. I'm going to leave you with this thought. James Madison, our fourth president, one of the Federalists of the day, in number 51, said this. He said, "Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it is obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit." Folks, I think we are in dire danger of losing liberty. We've lost a lot of liberties already. We're in dire danger of losing a lot because we've been in this pursuit of justice. We've been in this pursuit of security. I think it was Franklin that purportedly said that a people that's willing to give up a little bit of their liberty in order to gain a little bit of security deserve neither and will lose both. And you know what? I think the pursuit of justice that we've had in this country, I think it's shifted. I don't think it's so much a pursuit of justice anymore as it is a pursuit of fairness. And there is a difference. There is a fundamental difference between justice and fairness. Time does not allow us to get into that totally at the moment. But my sincere hope and my sincere prayer for America is that we will continue our pursuit of justice, but we will not lose a single additional liberty. And I appreciate men and women like yourselves that understand this, government leaders, present and future, that understand this, because that is the hope for America. God bless you. Thank you for allowing me to come and share some things.